Today we are talking about financial distortion, how truth becomes unreliable in court. This is Silence Screams Loud Strength, Unmasking Justice series. Numbers do not lie, but they can be presented to hide the truth. Good day and welcome. We have already explored how process can become power and how procedural advantage can shape the course of family court proceedings. Today we turn to a related but equally critical issue: financial distortion. This is not merely a matter of accounting or administrative detail. It is a fundamental threat to the integrity of the justice, and one that sits at the very center of how family law operates and how it can fail. In proceedings governed by the Matrimonial Causes Act 1973, especially under Section 25, and the primary task is to achieve a fair division of assets, income, and financial resources following separation. The legislation sets out clear objectives to meet the needs of any children, to compensate for financial disadvantage, to recognize contributions made during the relationship, and to ensure that outcomes are fair and just for both parties. These principles are not optional. They form the legal foundation upon which every financial remedy decision must be built. But there is a deeper principle that underpins all these effective justice methods. Truth must be reliable, because without reliable truth, the law cannot function. And without reliable truth, fairness cannot be achieved. The Macpherson report made it explicit. It reinforced that public confidence in the legal system depends on openness, accountability, and the rigorous pursuit of truth. The principle does not belong only to criminal law. It applies equally, fully, and forcefully to family proceedings, because if financial information is concealed, distorted, selectively presented, or structurally obscured, then the system is not operating on truth. It is operating on interpretation, and when interpretation replaces truth, justice becomes unstable. Okay, so let's speak about this in a legal context. What the law requires. Let us begin with what the law actually requires, because the law is not ambiguous on this point. In financial remedy proceedings governed by Section 25 of the Matrimonial Causes Act 1973, Family Procedure Rules Part 9, Practice Direction 9A, there is a clear and unequivocal obligation, full and frank disclosure. So it's full and frank disclosure. Every party is required to present a complete, accurate, and transparent account of their financial position. That includes income, assets, liabilities, business interests, pensions, property, and all financial resources available now or in the foreseeable future. This is not a procedural formality. This is the foundation upon which the court makes its decisions. So because Section 25 requires the court to assess financial resources, needs and obligations, standard of living, contribution, conduct where relevant, and the future financial position. And none of that can be assessed without accurate information. So truth is the backbone. If the information is incomplete, the assessment is incomplete. Then the information is misleading, which means the outcome is misleading. If the information is structured so that the outcome becomes structured. And that is where the integrity of the whole process begins to fracture. What financial distortion actually is? Financial distortion is not always obvious. It does not always present as fraud. It does not always appear unlawful. Often, it appears reasonable. It appears technical. It appears explainable. But that defines financial distortion. It is not meant to be distorted. In effect, it's meant to be clear, transparent. What the financial information presented to the court does not reflect the true position, then distortion exists. And distortion can occur through valuation of properties, income, presentation, assets, restructuring, liability position, and the narratives of framing things that are not supposed to be framed in that way, like shadow ledgers, because numbers do not exist in isolation. They are selected, interpreted, and presented. And where presentation is involved, control is possible. So valuation, where numbers shift, valuation sits at the heart of financial proceedings because value determines division, entitlement, and an outcome. But the valuation is not fixed. It is an interpretation. It's perceived. And an asset can be valued based on historic value, current value, market value, or projected value. So each method produces a different figure. Each figure tells a different story. And each story serves a different outcome. Where corporate structures are involved, this becomes even more complex. Assets may be held within companies, shielded within trusts, or layered across multiple entities. And the value presented then becomes distorted and may reflect what is not actually is or is not accessible at the time. Because the question is not what exists on paper. The question is, what actually is available? And that income where reality is filtered. That's where it's all filtered, and the income is the most frequently distorted elements in FDR, because income can be restructured, can be delayed, can be distorted, diverted, retained, or reclassified. A person may reduce declared income, reduce declared salary, retain profits within a company, reduce benefits of kind, or structure earnings through alternative mechanisms. On paper, income appears lower. In reality, resources remain accessible. And that is the distinction the court must identify. Because the law is not concerned with declared income alone. It is concerned with actual financial capacity. So, structures where ownership becomes unclear. On the most part, on the most significant areas of distortion is the asset structuring. Because ownership can be separated from control, assets can be placed in third-party names, held through corporations, entities, or distributed across layered structures so that they are not accessible or easily read. And while their all legal ownership may be clear or appear to be clear, beneficial ownership may not be. This creates a critical gap because the court must assess who benefits, who controls, and who has access, not simply who is named. And where structures obscure that distinction, trust becomes harder to identify. So the narrative where context is shaped, financial information does not stand alone. It is explained, it is framed, it is interpreted, and that is where the narrative of distortion emerges, because contradictions and contributions may be can be selectively presented. Financial history may be partially disclosed. Future needs may be exaggerated or minimized. And over time, a version of reality is constructed, not necessarily false, but a complete or incomplete picture is not presented in the legal proceedings. Incomplete truth can just as well cause damaging, or can also create falsehoods. So the impact where truth becomes unstable, when financial distortion enters the process, this is where the consequences are immediate. For the court, reflect reality. Financial scrutiny may be compromised, and fairness becomes uncertain. But the deeper impact here is systematic, because when people believe that truth can be shaped, outcomes can be influenced, and the financial reality can be manipulated, then confidence in the system begins to erode. And without confidence, justice cannot function, and justice cannot be done. So, where distortion meets power. Financial distortion does not operate alone. It operates alongside procedural advantage, because distortion creates delay, complexity, and costs, and those factors create pressure, and pressure creates imbalance, because the parties who can withstand or sustain the process, they absorb the cost and navigate the complexity, and they gain ground not through legal strength but through endurance. So, 5 years on, the reality in the family courts, 5 years ago, they changed the law, and the law recognized that domestic abuse includes financial coercion, control, financial abuse, non-physical harm. That was critical at the time. It still is a critical shift, but recognition alone is not empowering or implementation within the family courts, because financial distortion within the financial process or the legal process cannot still operate as it should. And where it does, financial abuse does not end. It evolves. It moves from private to control to procedural control, and that is the gap that exists, and that gap needs to be rectified, and that remains unaddressed, and that is taken advantage of by people that know how to manipulate the system. So the system response, the court does have the powers, but the court has not done and gone enough. They need to order further disclosures, appoint experts, draw adverse inference, impose cost consequences, and challenge inconsistencies. But these powers depend on visibility, and visibility depends on information being identifiable as unreliable. And that is where the difficulty lies, because distortion is often subtle, layered, technical, and resources intensify the challenge. And without the right expertise, there is structural limitation. There are system limitations that must be acknowledged within process, especially in an FDR. Limited integration between HMRC court systems are incomplete, access to companies' house data, absence of real-time verification, and resource constraints within the proceedings, because time is of the essence for most of the procedure within the court. So these are not failures of law, they are failures of structure. And in the system that depends on accurate information, structural gaps become a point of exploitation or points of exploitation because the gaps are far and wide and far too many. So process, power, and truth. We must now return to the central question. What is the purpose of a financial proceeding? Is it not to construct a narrative to minimize exposure, or is it to strategically position information, or is it to identify truth and apply the law to that truth fairly? When truth becomes unreliable, fairness becomes conditional. And when fairness becomes conditional, justice becomes uneven. So let us return to where we began. Numbers do not lie, but they can be presented to hide the truth. In family courts, in family law, that distortion matters because the system depends on accurate information, transparent disclosure, and accountable presentation. The Macpherson report still stands today as clear as 25 years ago when it was published. Trust depends on truth, and truth depends on integrity, not just in law, but in what is presented to the court. Okay. So a system that relies on accurate information to make a fair decision cannot afford to allow truth to be distorted. The integrity of the process depends on the integrity of the facts. Thank you for watching this episode. If it resonated with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. See you in the next episode.